Hello and welcome to VU Sports Wired, otherwise known this week as the UMBC Appreciation Hour. I'm Cutler Klein alongside Max Schneider and Drew Sundaram. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. We have a fantastic show for you today. Later on, we're going to be breaking down how our brackets have done so far after 1 and 2 and the first and second rounds of the NCAA Tournament. Spoiler alert, they're not doing great.
Not good.
Not great at all. I don't know how you can be when UMBC, the Retrievers, the good boys, upset the Virginia Cavaliers in the first round. We'll get to all that in just a little bit. But first, Vanderbilt has a winning baseball team. And by a winning baseball team, I mean one of the best baseball teams in the country. Vanderbilt Baseball entering the top 10 in the Baseball America rankings after demolishing the Mississippi State Bulldogs, who are a top 25 ranked team, I might add, in a weekend sweep down in Starkville. Guys, I mean, what kind of statement does this make for the Vanderbilt baseball team to not only going to the first SEC series against the top opponent, not just win the series, but sweep it?
Right, I think it makes a big statement. I also think that we need to pump the brakes a little bit before we get too carried away or too excited with it. Definitely great series, great way to open up SEC play. But I think that we need to specifically take a look at what type of statement this means for the Commodore team moving forward. I mean, Mississippi State was a top 25 team when they swept them. But I think what's even more impressive is what the Commodores did with opportunities when they came up in the game. They batted .538 with runners in scoring position. And an even more impressive stat than that is that Mississippi State went 1 for 21 when they had runners on base, which means that not only were the Doors taking advantage of scoring opportunities by getting runners in, but they were also being able to shut down Mississippi State's offense, and the pitchers weren't getting flustered after allowing a hit or two. I think that's huge, especially when it comes to consistency, especially when it comes to this team being able to deliver when the situation isn't the greatest. I think that it's really good for the mindset of the team that they're able to limit opportunities for opponents while being able to convert on opportunities for themselves as well. So I think that when you're looking at the type of statement they're making, it's definitely a positive one. It's definitely one that shows that they're not going to get flustered and they're actually going to convert on all these opportunities that they might be seeing.
Yeah, you talked about guys kind of pitching out of jams and timely hitting, and you usually expect that from veterans, and we see that especially on the staff with Fellows and Raby. Both guys, they're going to allow some hits, they're going to walk some batters, but 11 combined shutout innings over this past weekend, not letting those mistakes come back to bite them, not letting a walk turn into 2 walks or 2 hits or anything that's going to really hurt them in the long run. And so that's what you've seen from this team, being able to weather the storm, kind of building on these leads, getting those runners in scoring position and scoring those guys. And it's been extremely impressive. Now this Vanderbilt team, 7-1 against the top 25. And for a young team, that's extremely impressive to come out of the gates this hot and start SEC play this hot. If we look back to last season, I mean, non-conference was a huge problem for them. And then coming into the SEC season, they didn't have a sweep for a much longer time. First weekend of SEC play is a sweep for this team. So you have to love what you're seeing really on both sides of the ball. I especially love what we've seen out of Fellows and Raby. Those two guys, if they continue to improve, and remember Raby's still coming back from that injury, if those two guys continue to improve, this is as formidable a 1-2 punch as you'll find. And so looking forward, I mean, the sky's the limit for this team. But I do think, like you said, pump the brakes a little bit. There are a lot of great teams in the SEC. They're going to run into some teams like Florida, LSU this weekend that will really test them even further. But right now, you have to love what you're seeing from this team.
You know, we'll get to LSU in just a moment. But, I mean, the biggest thing for this in this series for me is you look at last year, when this team was going into SEC play, they needed some momentum. They needed to be able to find themselves, to be able to bring themselves out of the rut that they put themselves in non-conference play. This year, it's the complete opposite of that. They've absolutely dominated non-conference play. They lost a couple of tight ones. They lost a couple in the Shriners Classic in Houston. They lost at least one of their games in California, although their loss was certainly not as big as the 2 wins that they had against really top opponents in UCLA and in TCU at Dodger Stadium. So this was essentially a continuation of the momentum. And now look, you're going to find better teams in the SEC than Mississippi State, but they were ranked. The SEC is perhaps the deepest conference in college baseball right now, so you're going to run into much better teams than Mississippi State. Do you feel like it's important that this series, you know, we've talked about in non-conference play that they needed to take care of business against the teams they were supposed to beat because they couldn't do it last year. We cite the UIC series last year all the time. Now it's getting to the point where, all right, they've done that in non-conference play. Now let's see if they can take care of business against the SEC opponents that maybe they should be. Look, Mississippi State was no easy out at all. They were a top 25 team. That's a big deal, whether you like it or not. Is it important that they're kind of taking care of business against not necessarily the top echelon of the SEC, but still really good teams?
Right, I think it's really interesting that you use that phrase, taking care of business, because when you're looking at how they've been playing so far, the Commodores are dominant in every facet of the game. They can pitch lights out, they can get batters and runners in, and it seems like every week there's a different freshman whose either bat comes alive or arm comes alive. So the fact that they're getting so much contribution from so many different areas means that even 1 week, if one of the areas isn't as great for them, they should be able to get over the edge. So taking care of business, definitely, but in an impressive fashion.
Yeah, I agree, and especially moving forward, I mean, like we said, Mississippi State, a ranked team, but not really the top of the SEC, and we'll see that in the coming weeks. But definitely, I mean, in the sport of baseball, taking 2 of 3 is a win against a top 25 team. You can't expect to win all these games, so a sweep is great, but I just want to see consistency moving forward. As long as they don't hit one of these slumps and really fall off the edge and maybe get swept one weekend or go 1-2 the next, as long as they don't have runs like that, this team can beat anybody, and we'll see that this weekend with LSU.
One of the things that I also look at as this team goes forward is that they are still going to have some midweek games. They have Belmont coming up tonight in a postponed game at First Tennessee Park. Next week they have Lipscomb. These are 2 teams that are good. They're certainly good non-power conference teams, but Vanderbilt's going to have to take care of business in those because, those games. What's the key really here to prevent overlooking these games? And if you're Vanderbilt, because you have so many really important SEC series, but these games could be trap games for Vanderbilt because, and I'm not saying that 1 loss to Belmont or 1 loss to Lipscomb is going to tank the whole season, but if you get caught off guard by a team like that in a midweek game, maybe it's putting some doubt in your mind, maybe it's slowing the momentum, and maybe it hurts you on the weekend. Not necessarily in terms of your staff or anything, but just in terms of the mental aspect, the momentum.
Right, I think that's going to be big on coaching. I'm going to say this mainly has to do with coaching and making sure players are in the right mindset on this one. Because especially with how good and deep the SEC is, it's going to be very easy for players to overlook that midweek game and for them to start thinking and game planning for the weekend. So from a coaching standpoint, making sure they're playing it 1 game at a time, that they are taking care of business, that they're not getting too ahead of themselves, because that's how you can really get that drop-off. If you're losing consistently midweek games, then that's going to hurt your record in the end.
Yeah, I think it's coaching. I think it's also pitching, and especially in these Tuesday, Wednesday games, when you have guys who are veterans of the program who understand, hey, we lost some of these games last year, games that we really shouldn't have lost, and really have to iron it out in these games. And guys like Maddox Conger and Chandler Day are 2 guys that'll probably be throwing a lot of these midweek starts, and I think that's key. I think that's a great idea by Corbin to get these veterans into these midweek slots. They understand the importance of these games. They understand that you can't take any game for granted in the SEC, but also in these games against Belmont and in these games against Lipscomb. So we'll see pitchers that have had the experience in these midweek games, and I think that's really the key going forward. It's okay to throw a freshman on Sunday and to throw a junior on Tuesday.
If there's any coach that is going to be able to coach a team through a midweek series like this, it's Tim Corbin. Tim Corbin knows his stuff. He commands the respect to be able to coach a team through that, and he doesn't take midweek losses very lightly, especially at this point of the season. Moving on now to this weekend's series against LSU, a top-ranked SEC team. Vanderbilt taking on the Tigers Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Those games can be seen on ESPNU for the first 2, and then the Sunday matinee going to be on ESPN2. So 3 huge nationally televised games for the Commodores and the Tigers. How important is this series this weekend? Not necessarily for just its value as in the opponent, in a top 25 opponent that is better than Mississippi State by a good little bit, but just being able to show what Vanderbilt can do on a national stage, because Vanderbilt commands respect, and they're starting to command a little bit more after coming into the season with not so high expectations, not as high as we normally might give them. Is this an important series to be able to prove themselves on a national stage?
I'm actually going to go ahead and say this is kind of a deceptively unimportant series, and I think that a lot of people see all 3 games televised on some form of ESPN network, but I think Vanderbilt has proved in the first half of this season that they're able to beat any team, and we saw that with TCU, with UCLA, we saw it with Mississippi State this past weekend. LSU is in that upper echelon of teams like TCU and UCLA but it's a team that Vanderbilt's proven that they can beat. So yes, they don't want to go out there and get swept. But I think people that follow this team closely, like we do, understand that this team, a loss out to LSU, doesn't diminish what this team has done and what this team has the potential to do. I think what this game and this series does do is it enables some of these guys that people don't know as well on an individual basis to put their names on the map. Because Vanderbilt doesn't have a Jaron Kendall or a Kyle Wright this year, guys who are first-round draft picks and household names. They have guys who are leading the offense like Pat DeMarco and guys like Austin Martin, names that aren't that household and people probably don't know. So on an individual basis, these games give guys the potential to put their names on the map and put Vanderbilt's name on the map. But I don't think a win or loss in this series really changes the potential of this program going forward and what this program can do.
Right. When I'm looking at this series, I definitely think it's important. But I think it's important for reasons beyond just purely record. Because Max, you said, we know that this team can compete with the best of the best. I mean, they're ranked top 10 for a reason. But I want to see two specific things out of this series. I want to see poise from freshmen on a much bigger stage, because inherently when the lights are on, inherently when you're talking about a team that, knock on wood, we want to see in Omaha, you're going to have to see the freshmen performing in more stressful situations. And I think inherently having the factor of a nationally broadcasted game is going to be huge, especially because I bet you can set an over-under on the amount of times the broadcasters are going to mention #1 overall draft class or recruiting class.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be a really huge thing to see how they handle that moment. And the second thing that I want to see is consistency, because again, we've seen the Commodores play really well over this first stretch of games, but I want to make sure that there's not going to be a significant drop-off. This isn't just a hot start, that the bats aren't just alive for this first month or so. So I want to see the poise, and I want to see consistency in this series.
One thing that I'm noticing about the way this series is shaping up to be is that it's a battle of depth. It's a battle of just two teams that have a lot of different players that can make plays and make an impact. In the past, you've seen this series have some star-studded potential. Before it was Alex Bregman versus Dansby Swanson. Those are two guys that are becoming household names to an extent in the MLB, at least among baseball fans. This series doesn't have that vibe. How does that kind of difference in the way this Commodore team looks, especially the Commodore team where there's not really one superstar that you can point to that's really making a difference? It's just batting through 9 guys and pitching through a deep rotation.
Yeah, I mean, one, it gives certain guys a chance to make themselves names, like those two guys. Obviously, those two some of the best to do it in the SEC when they played here. But I think it's interesting that when you look at Vanderbilt's team up and down, you can have a guy who gets 3 hits one day and he's on the bench a week later for 3 straight games. And we've seen that with Alonzo Jones. He's kind of fallen out of the lineup a little bit after going 6 for 6 on stolen bases, after getting 2-3 hits in multiple games. It just shows the depth of this team, and one guy doesn't really need to be the star for Vanderbilt, and I know that's something we throw around a lot. Oh, one guy doesn't have to be the star, but when you have a team of multiple top recruiting classes, everybody can hit and everybody can play, and Tim Corbin feels comfortable with whatever lineup he puts out there. So yeah, it might not be one guy like a Dansby Swanson who really runs the show this weekend, but there's still talent out there. There's a lot of talent out there, especially from the Vanderbilt side, and I think more of that will come on the mound. And I'm really interested in seeing how Fellows goes after these LSU hitters, because LSU, predominantly one of the best hitting programs in college baseball. Fellows has had his share of tests over the first few weeks in the season, but this is the best hitting team he's going to face so far.
Right, I think it's going to be a great opportunity to show off the Vanderbilt program as a whole, too. Because again, I said earlier, they can beat you in every asset of the game. So I think that a lot of people are actually going to be able to see how dominant they are in pitching, how well they're batting this year, just how deep the entire rotation and the lineup is. I think the fact that people are actually going to be able to see how this is a very holistic-looking Vanderbilt team, that's a really good opportunity.
Before we move on from baseball, biggest key for the series for Vanderbilt to be able to come out on top?
Got to go with the bullpen still. And I know the starting pitching is probably going to be there from Fellows and Raby, but the bullpen's really held them intact throughout these first few games. In Game 3 that we saw against Mississippi State, a 4-3 lead going into the 9th. That's a lead that last year, and maybe at points earlier this season, we're really not comfortable with them being able to hold. They were able to hold it easily with Tyler Brown throwing 4 shutout innings. The bullpen's going to need to be on point in this series, especially those guys like Tyler Brown who've been able to do it so far.
Right, I think we need to see exactly what we saw in the Mississippi State series. The batting .538 with runners in scoring position is huge. So I think that they really can't afford to leave runners stranded, especially in a series that's going to be as close as this.
Guys, baseball talk, it's not the hot stove anymore. We've got a great season on our hands for Vanderbilt baseball. Now moving back to the hardwood, Vanderbilt watching from the couch this year, but the NCAA tournament action has been anything but cold. The first weekend of the tournament has come and gone, and oh my goodness, that was a mess. That was an absolute mess. There you have 16 seeds beating 1 seeds. You've got teams called the Wolfpack beating the Bearcats in Nashville. You have every team from Cincinnati losing. You have a 98-year-old nun that's become an internet sensation. I mean, this tournament has everything you could possibly want. So, guys, how's your bracket doing? I can't imagine it's doing that well. Mine certainly isn't. I had Virginia winning it all. But to be perfectly honest, I'm not that upset about it. I'm not that upset that Virginia lost. If they had lost to a team like Kentucky in the Sweet 16, I would have been livid, perhaps. But I'm not that mad because UMBC is so likable. They're so unbelievably likable. It was one of the most incredible college basketball games that we'll ever see in our lifetime, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, obviously, bracket's not doing too great. Half my Final Four is out. I did have Gonzaga against Villanova for my championship game. Villanova's looking pretty strong. Gonzaga's figuring out a way to win games. They should be winning by a lot more. So at least those two teams are still alive, so there's still a lot of points on the table for my bracket. But just having to look up that UMBC means the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous storyline from the weekend. But again, so likable. The fact that their Twitter account came alive and they just had genius social media marketing the entire time. So perfect. It's a lot of really fun storylines. Really not the best for my bracket, but we're having a good time.
Yeah, a lot of great games, obviously, this weekend. UMBC, one of them. Sunday's games, too. I mean, those upsets. Florida State over Xavier. I know a lot of people didn't have a lot of faith in Xavier as a 1 seed, but who was talking about Florida State being able to make a double-digit comeback and win that game? And just before that, the biggest second-half comeback in NCAA history with Nevada topping Cincinnati, coming back from 22 points down. I mean, it just goes to show in this tournament, flip a coin and pick the games that way because it's so impossible to tell who's going to win these games. And Leonard Hamilton said something, the coach of Florida State, after this game that I thought was really interesting. He said it just goes to show that when you seed these teams, they really aren't that far apart. And a 2 seed and a 9 seed might look really far apart, but it's the difference of 1 loss during the season. And that's why you see so many of these upsets. And it's true. And one thing, I know, Drew, we had the same Final Four, so obviously I woke up Thursday morning and I switched Michigan State to Duke right before the game started for this exact reason, because Syracuse every year, and I said they shouldn't have been in the tournament, they didn't belong here, and every year they do this, and they win, the zone comes alive. That game was an incredible game to watch. They were out-rebounded by more than 20 rebounds and still won that game, so I haven't gotten a lot right, but that's one thing that I have gotten right so far, and I'll hang my hat on that.
Right. On that note, I was watching the Michigan State-Syracuse game really closely, and the fact that that 2-3 zone literally stifled all Michigan State offensive production, and they would get a board every time, but they just got swarmed by the 3 defenders on the baseline, and they just couldn't figure out how to score for the last 5 minutes of that game. Really made a difference. That Duke-Syracuse matchup with both the 2-3 zones is going to be a lot of fun to watch.
That should be very, very fun. And it's funny to look at the different sides of the bracket because if you look at the left side, that was where UMBC happened. That was where Loyola Chicago happened. That is where Cincinnati, Nevada, and where Florida State happened. That's a mess. But if you look at the right side, I mean, I'm doing fine. My entire Sweet 16 from the East region is still there. All but one of my Sweet 16 in the other in the Midwest, aside from Michigan State, and 3 of my 4 Final Four are still there. Yep. You got Michigan, Villanova, and Duke still alive. Of course, my champion's done, but I'm just basically going to be rooting for everyone else's champions to lose now, if that's the case. One thing I have to say is that my South Dakota State Jackrabbits let me down. They let me down big time in the first round against Ohio State, letting up a 4-point play when it was tied at 70 in the final minutes of the game.
That was tough.
I mean, the Jackrabbits, they're letting me down. They're still letting me down. But I mean, what are you guys most looking forward to about the rest of this tournament? Because we've had so much fun already. There's been so many incredible games. Max, you got to see in person 2 of the biggest upsets and comebacks in NCAA tournament history in Nashville for the Nevada game and for Florida State. What are you most looking forward to about the way the rest of the tournament could go?
I'm looking to see how legitimate some of these teams really are. And I know Nevada with 2 huge upsets. Can they make that Final Four push? Can Kansas State make that push? Which of these teams is going to be for real and not just for the first weekend? Because it seems that every year we have one of these teams. Last year, South Carolina. Which of these teams on the left side of the bracket is going to get it done? And one matchup that I'm really looking forward to is Villanova and West Virginia. Because I obviously have Villanova as a champion. I think they're the best team in college basketball. But the way West Virginia took care of business in their first 2 games, absolutely dominating. Javon Carter was toying with Marshall in that second game. Watching that press against Villanova's backcourt with Jalen Brunson and Michael Bridges is going to be extremely interesting. I can't wait for that matchup.
Right. For me, this part of March Madness is completely different than the animal we saw that first weekend, because it goes from just like kind of like craziness and insanity. There's a game on every 15 minutes, or at least that's what it seems like. I feel like we're going to see a lot more polished basketball, and I'm really excited to see just like really good basketball plays, like really good matchups. I think that the dynamic of the tournament changed a lot after that first weekend, so I think that we're just going to be able to see just like really good individual games.
I'm looking at the South region, and it's Kansas State, Kentucky, Loyola, Chicago, and Nevada. There's no top 4 seeds. If Kentucky doesn't make the Final Four, something has seriously gone wrong in my mind, because, I mean, no knock on Loyola, Chicago, Nevada, or Kansas State, but you would never put them in the same category as Kentucky, not even this season, when Kentucky hasn't even been as good as they usually are. So that's going to be interesting for me to see how Kentucky somehow finagled their way into an easy path to the Final Four. The other thing I'm looking at is I think Duke could be ready for a serious run, because you have a lot of teams that had some trouble in the early rounds. They didn't have a great, they stumbled a little bit. Duke won each of their games by 20 or more points. It's crazy. They just absolutely dominated Iona and then flattened URI, who had done a good job to contain Trae Young in Oklahoma. Syracuse is by no means an easy out, but they still have a very good path to the Final Four, and they haven't really exactly had to be shaken up in any sort of way or troubled by any of their first 2-round games. So if you had to revise your brackets now, guys, who would you pick as your champion? If I assume you could be sticking with the same ones if they're still in.
Right. So I would probably choose Villanova to be my champion at this point, just seeing how they've handled those first 2 rounds. I think if they beat West Virginia, definitely almost a lock at that point for me to get to the championship game. A team that I really want to pay a lot of attention to right now is Texas A&M, because the way they beat UNC and the fact that Michigan barely beat Houston, I think that they're primed for a pretty deep run as well.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with Villanova just because that's the team I've had all the way. Villanova over probably Kentucky now, and Kentucky has such an easy road, if there even is an easy road in March. But this is what happens when John Calipari comes out and complains about their draw every year, and then this year they get a 12 seed, a 13 seed, an 8 seed, and then possibly an 11 seed all on the way to the Final Four. So you just never know what's going to happen, but I like Kentucky's chances just because their matchups are so favorable on the way to the finals, but I still have to go Villanova.
I had to pick Duke just because of the way they've looked. They've looked so incredibly good. They've been cakewalking through it. I had them in the final anyways, but I do think that they're a team that just has the depth and the overall skill to be able to get back to the top of college basketball. So it'll be a fun couple of weeks in the remaining games of the NCAA Tournament, headed to the Final Four in San Antonio. With that, that'll just about do it for this week's episode of VU Sports Wired. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. For Max Schneider and Drew Sundaram, I'm Cutler Klein saying so long, and we'll see you next time.